Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and this episode is TTS Thursday number 17. Today's topic is how to train between 2 or more races in quick succession. But before we get into that, big thanks to our sponsors. First, we have Precision Hydration, and Precision Hydration have exciting news. They have recently launched their product line of Precision Fuel. Precision Fuel is simply a range of products that allows you to get in carbohydrates during training and racing, and they have gels and drink mix available currently. Everything in this product range is 30 grams of carbohydrates per serving, making it super easy for you to know your numbers and hit your numbers. The products are a 2-to-1 glucose to fructose ratio to maximize carbohydrate uptake. They're Informed Sport certified, so you can be sure that they will not have any contamination issues. The flavor is mild and neutral to minimize flavor fatigue or minimize the risk of flavor fatigue. They don't contain any artificial ingredients, and they also don't contain caffeine, sodium, or any other things really than carbohydrates, because Precision Hydration's philosophy is that you should be able to pull all of the levers that you want to pull separately and independently. So again, it's all about being able to hit your numbers without making it complicated by having many things in one single package or serving. You can get 15% off your entire Precision Hydration order, whether it's electrolytes or Precision Fuel products, with the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW15 on precisionhydration.com. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Roka are the world-leading manufacturers of wetsuits, drysuits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses. Whether you're looking to go faster in the open water, get more performance, comfort, and aerodynamics out of your tri-suit, or find a perfect pair of eyeglasses combining function, comfort, and design, Roka have an option for you based on exceptional R&D and attention to every single detail in their product ranges. I use multiple Roka products personally, from the Maverick X2 wetsuit to the Rory prescription sunglasses and many things in between, including sunglasses, buoyancy shorts, tri-suits, and much more. And I can honestly say that all of them are really amazing products that I really love to use. You can get 20% off your Roka order with the discount that you can get on roka.com/TTS. One thing before we get into the episode today, I have a general update about the podcast. I have been releasing at least 2 episodes per week. There was a period when I was doing 3 episodes per week, actually, that some listeners may remember, but generally 2 episodes per week, every single week since the end of February 2017. And if somebody is listening to this in the future, it is now June 2021 as I'm recording this. It's been a lot of fun, and it's been amazing to get all of the positive feedback that many of you listeners have been sending in. But it is a lot of work for every single episode, much more than it may seem based on the duration of the episodes. For these solo episodes, I'm definitely not just turning on the microphone and starting blabbering, but actually spending many hours just on the preparation of the episode. And the same goes for interviews, where finding high quality guests to interview, researching them, preparing questions for the interviews and so on really takes up a lot of time. So with all of that work, it does take away time from other things that are also really important to me, like coaching, obviously, and taking care of the business side of Scientific Triathlon and all the other things that are going on there besides the podcast. So I have made a decision that from July, so from next week, I'm going to go decrease the frequency of episodes to just 1 episode per week, which will be a Monday episode with show notes as per usual. And this can be both interviews and solo episodes, so we'll keep the different formats of episodes that we've been having, but all of them will be on Mondays, and it will be just 1 episode per week, which will give me more time to use on the other things that I really want to get more time for. Another aspect behind this decision is that by now there is a massive back catalog and archive of episodes, and honestly, I don't always find it easy to come up with a topic that hasn't been discussed before, or find a new guest with as much credibility as I like the guests to have. So these things to me are also signs that maybe it's a good time now to reduce the frequency of episodes, just to make sure that I can maintain the quality of the podcast and not just produce content for the production of content's sake, if that makes sense. Of course, I welcome any feedback on this decision, but until the end of the year, I'm going to stick to this podcast schedule regardless and test it out, and then reevaluate and see whether it's something that will keep going or if I'll go back to 2 episodes per week after that. So, but yeah, any feedback is definitely more than welcome. Just get in touch with me and let me know what you think. All right, so now let's move into the main topic, which is how to train between successive races. Let's first define what we mean here by racing 2 or more races in quick succession. For the purpose of this episode, I'd say that it means having the second race be within 3 weeks of the first race. Of course, you might potentially have a third race as well in quick succession after the second race. And again, the same thing applies. It would have to be 3 weeks or sooner after the second race for it to be kind of covered by the scope of this episode. Why 3 weeks, you might be wondering? And that is a fair question. I'm not saying that it's the right selection of a timeline. It might be a bit too long or maybe a bit too short. But quite often when we are really generalizing heavily, we might say that for the average race, you might taper for 1 week and recover for 1 week. And if we take that average case and the races are 3 weeks apart, it only leaves 1 week of really productive training, which is a short amount of time. And this is, of course, what makes knowing what to do between races so challenging, that you have a short amount of time to actually do productive training. Now, we'll find out later on in this episode that it's not necessarily 1 week of taper and 1 week of recovery always, but the point still stands that from that generalized perspective, it makes sense to have 3 weeks as the sort of the benchmark. Whereas if you have 4 weeks of time between races, then actually if you recover quickly and taper quickly, then you might even get in an entire training block between those 2 races. So that becomes a bit too long to count as quick succession. Now the question, what to do with your time that you have between races that are within 3 weeks of each other. Of course, it could be 1 week after each other or 2 weeks after each other. That's what we'll tackle here. And note that I will not discuss racing in quick succession after an Ironman race, because although it can be possible for certain athletes in certain circumstances, generally it's not advisable. So I will leave that out from the scope of this episode. And we're assuming here that we're talking about sprint, Olympic, or half distance races. So let's just briefly outline what we'll discuss here. First, we'll discuss how long to recover after a race, then how long to taper before the next race. Then we'll go into how much training and how much hard training you should be doing between races. And finally, we'll discuss the importance of building a strong base to maintain fitness between races. So if we tackle recovery from the first race as the first point here, how much recovery you need from a race will vary hugely from individual to individual, and it also varies for different race distances and disciplines. A duathlon would be different than a triathlon, for example, and also for different racing courses. So if you have a very hilly triathlon, that might take more recovery than a very flat triathlon, especially if you're doing a lot of fast downhill running. Now, in terms of individuality, a young and really fit athlete racing sprints and Olympics could recover in a couple of days from a sprint or even an Olympic race, whereas an athlete who is new to the sport, maybe not so fit, maybe a bit older, and maybe trying to recover from a 7.3 race, they will probably need up to a week even to recover from that race fully. So those are several factors that impact recovery and how it can really change the time course of recovery. Just to give you some ballpark numbers, and again, keep in mind, this is all individual, so what I'm saying here should be taken as a starting point, but your mileage may vary. I would say that for pretty fit and experienced athletes, then they can recover from a sprint generally in 2 days, from an Olympic in 3 days, and from a 7.3 in 4 to 5 days. If you're a bit older or not very fit or both, then you might add 1 to 2 days to each of those as a benchmark. But again, this is very much just ballpark numbers. Knowing yourself is key, and you get to know yourself just by racing and experimenting. So if you use these numbers as a starting point, then that's all fine. But when you really start to feel that you're fully recovered in training and outside of training, that is probably when you are fully recovered. And when that happens, make sure that you log that in your training so that you know for future reference. And over time, as you race more and more and get more and more data, then you will get a good sense for how long it takes you to recover for different race distances. Now, how to recover in terms of the pattern of getting back to training, it varies a little bit by distance. So a sprint race, I would say for, again, a reasonably fit athlete with quite a bit of experience, can almost be treated as a very hard workout. You can probably do some aerobic training the next day, basic zone 1 or zone 2 training in a 5-zone system. And then on the second day after the race, I usually might still keep things aerobic, but volume can be perfectly normal, back to what you usually do. And then the third day, essentially, you can be back in your normal training, because the sprint distance is around an hour, maybe a bit shorter or a bit longer, depending on your fitness. But it can essentially be seen as a really hard workout, so that it makes sense that recovery is not super long from it. For Olympic and 7.3 races, I do like to, and I should mention here, by the way, that all of these things that I'll mention in this episode, this is my opinion only. There's no right or wrong answer necessarily, but so you'll hear my opinions and how I do things in my coaching. So then coming back to, for Olympic and 7.3 racing, I like to give athletes a day of full recovery. Or optionally, if the athlete prefers a short active recovery session, swim or bike, they can do that, like 30 minutes, super easy. The second day after on Olympic or 7.3 would be zone 1 training and low volume. And the third day would be zone 2 or maybe even some zone 3 or zone 4 swimming would be possible, especially after an Olympic race. And the fourth day, we can definitely do swim training as normal, and generally maybe some zone 3 training in cycling, maybe even in running. From the fifth or sixth day, we can generally train normally. Volume, just like intensity, would gradually increase through these 4 to 5 days. So where you start with a rest day, the second day is a light and short day. The third day, you might already have some reasonably decent volume there. And of course, the Olympic distance, you accelerate volume and intensity a little bit faster than 7.3, but they're not necessarily super different in the recovery time course. Again, keeping in mind here that we're talking about a generally pretty fit and experienced athlete here with these patterns. So your mileage may vary, as they say, but the general principle of starting with little or no volume at the start of the recovery and very low intensity, and then gradually increasing both volume and intensity over a few days, that's something that I've seen work really well time and time again to recover quickly, but also not lose too much fitness. And it's just about, well, exactly how quickly do you do it? For some athletes, it might be 3 or 4 days, even after 7.3. For others, it's more like 6 to 8 days. So that's where you need to experiment a little bit. In terms of tapering, how long should you taper for a race when racing in quick succession after another? I mentioned that we often take 1 week of taper as a given before any semi-important race. But actually, I think there is a lot of variability in how long you need to taper from one race to another, based simply on how much accumulated training load and fatigue you have to shed. So before the first race in a series of races, if you have been training consistently and accumulated quite some training load, then yeah, it makes sense to taper for a week, maybe even more, depending on the race distance and factors such as your athletic phenotype. That makes total sense because you have accumulated a lot of training load. But let's say you do that and then you recover for a few days after that race. While you did have a huge training load dumped upon you from the race itself, your overall accumulated training load is going to be quite low after you've come out of this recovery period. And this is something you can quite easily see, for example, in the performance management chart in Training Peaks or similar tools in other software, where you basically see your chronic and acute training loads. And as regular listeners will know, I don't really agree with how it's used and rely upon always, but I think it can illustrate trends really well. And you will see that a few days into your recovery after a race, your CTL is very clearly on its way down, and so is your ATL, so chronic training load and acute training load is CTL and ATL for those not familiar with those metrics. So basically what that means is that you don't have a huge accumulated training load on you once you get out of that period, just because you tapered, so you had less training load, and then yeah, you did have the race, but you also had a few days of recovery. So it's just that one big dump of load over a period of several days or even a week and a half or more. So this is a completely different state to be in than the one you were in as you started tapering for the first race, where you had maybe months and months of training leading into it, and probably a lot of hard specific training in the last few weeks, you just had much more deloading to do and fatigue to shed before that first race than before the second race, generally speaking. So let's discuss a little bit based on the different durations between races. If your races are 3 weeks apart, then you can obviously do more training in between them, but that means that you might also need to do a bit more tapering because you will have started to again accumulate that training load. I still don't think that most athletes need a week, as much as a week between, if you have 3 weeks between races, but maybe 3 to 4 days, 3 to 5 days, depending on your profile. If races are 2 weeks apart, then after having recovered from your first race, you might have 7-8 days or so of normal training, and then you have 2 to 3 days to taper. So with only 7 to 8 days of normal training load, then that 2 to 3 days of deloading is usually plenty to feel really good and fresh on race day. So actually with races 2 weeks apart, the taper can be as short as 2 to 3 days. And if the races are 1 week apart, you won't really get many, if any, normal training days in. You might get a pretty normal training day with perhaps some key intensity in on, let's say, the first day, if you're racing Sunday and Sunday, and then get into a two-day taper before that Sunday race after first day. But you're recovering up to that first day, and then tapering after that. So with 1 week apart, you get one normal day of training perhaps, but you're banking on doing just enough work to maintain the fitness you had going into the first race. And generally, less is more in this situation in terms of training. However, if you are in a situation where perhaps you're racing multiple weekends in a row with just one races 1 week apart, then you can't necessarily just recover like this every single week. Eventually, you will start to lose fitness by doing that. So you might do this sort of just recovering up until first day and then tapering from Friday between race 1 and race 2. But from race 2 to race 3, I would try to get in at least one more solid endurance day, and then in addition to one solid intensity day. So perhaps those days might be Wednesday and Thursday, or Thursday and Friday. And if you go on for even more weeks of racing back to back to back, I'd say that the need to get in those solid endurance days of reasonable volume in particular keeps increasing. But that being said, the races themselves can form most of your intensity, and having just one day with some intensity in the week between the races is usually more than enough on the training side. Now, let's discuss how much training you should be doing between races, and also how hard you should be training between races. But we'll start with how much, the volume. I already described the pattern of gradually increasing volume during that recovery from the first race, then having anything from 1 to 2 normal days, quote unquote, if you have only 1 week between races, to up to 2 weeks of normal volume training if you have 3 weeks between races, before decreasing volume again during the taper. That is the pattern. But how much should you be doing especially in those days of quote unquote normal training volume? So this will depend entirely on how much training you're used to doing. What is your baseline? So I think that a good way of approaching this is to look at your average daily training volume for, let's say, the 6 weeks leading up to the taper before your first race. And if you averaged, say, 1.5 hours of training per day for this period, then during however many days you have between recovering after the first race and tapering for the second race, let's say, for argument's sake, that it's 7 days if you have 2 weeks to go between 2 races, then you can train roughly 1.5 hours per day on average during that 7-day period. Of course, this is an average. Maybe one day in there is a 3-hour day, another day is a complete rest day. And also you need to play it a bit by ear perhaps, or at least experience over time will tell you that maybe you need to get in one longer day, especially if the second race is a 7.3 or similar. So that might skew things a little bit. But as a good rule of thumb, I think this applies and works well. I do think that it applies mostly and works the best if you are really consistent. So those 6 weeks that you take the average from, if they have been really good, consistent training without interruptions. But if you had a week in there where you didn't train, then that's not really good. And maybe you should look at, what is the period of 3 to 4 weeks leading up to the race where I had a really good uninterrupted training period where I could just train normally and take that and average from that the daily training load that is your baseline. Then the recovery period and the taper period, in terms of volume, you just build up to the volume of your normal period and then build down from that baseline as you taper. The other important question is, of course, how much intensity you should be doing between races. This is quite tricky and quite individual, but as a general rule of thumb, if in doubt, less is more. And by less, I refer primarily to the overall intensity load. So you might still be doing a swim, a bike, and a run with some form of intensity, even with races just 1 week apart. So the frequency there of intensity is not necessarily small, but the load of intensity in any one of those sessions would often be quite low, of course, depending on the athlete and the context. For example, let's say you're doing 2 Olympic distance races 1 week apart. You could do as your intense swim set during that week, you could do 10 times 100 at race pace. And that is a pretty easy set, to be honest, to do. And on the bike, you could do 5 times 4 minutes at race pace. Again, considering an Olympic distance bike might take you 1 hour plus minus something, that is a pretty easy session. And the run might be 5 times 3 minutes at race pace. And again, since the run might take you anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, that's not that much. So the intensity load in any of those sessions is pretty small. But they do make sure that you activate your body to perform at the intensities that you will use on race day. So generally what this does is that it reduces the risk of feeling stale because you just did easy training between the 2 races. So I do think it's important to get it in. Just to note that some athletes might absolutely do more than the example I described between back-to-back races, but the principle that I illustrated was that less is more as applied to the overall training load, but not to the frequency necessarily. We're still getting in a little bit of intensity in each discipline. Now, if you have 2 weeks between races, then of course you can do a bit more intensity. And as we discussed in the previous example of getting 7 quote-unquote normal training days between those 2 races, especially if you're an intermediate or advanced athlete, you can probably do your frequency of intense work in that 7-day period can be similar or the same as it has been in your regular training weeks leading up to the first race. The same principle applies when you have 3 weeks between races as well. I would just recommend that in either one of these cases, you pay extra attention to always having a little bit left in the tank in these intense sessions, not going super deep in any of those sessions the way you might have done in the base training phase or before you were in the race season. So yeah, saving a little bit of something and just giving all of that extra energy when it actually comes to racing. So to give an example here, if you normally train twice per day and do 2 hard swims, bikes, and runs any given week, then you can probably include 2 hard swims, bikes, and runs if you have 2 weeks between races, because that means that you probably have 7 or 8 days of normal training in that period. And if you have 3 weeks between races, that means that you have probably 14 days or so of normal training. So you can do 4 hard bikes, 4 hard swims, and 4 hard runs in that training period. Again, we're assuming here that the total duration of the recovery plus taper equals more or less 1 week in these examples. But then you just do the math or adjust accordingly if that is not the case. So you can see here that for people that train quite a lot as their baseline, you can do a good amount of training and hard training. After all, if races are 3 weeks apart in particular, that's a good 2 week training block you can get in there after recovering and before tapering. For beginners, I would say it's probably smart to err on the side of caution and limit things to perhaps 1 solid intense session per discipline, maybe 2 for swimming, as it's a bit less taxing than running and cycling. If you are racing 2 weeks apart, and if you are racing 3 weeks apart, then you can add 1 intense session of each discipline to that. But in the example of 2 weeks apart, you could, for example, do your first intense swim after the first race on a Thursday or Friday, and then a hard bike ride on Saturday and a hard run on Sunday, and then another solid swim on Tuesday or Wednesday, and for the most part keep the rest of that week easy. But just to reiterate a couple of key things on this point, less is more, especially if you're in doubt and not quite sure what you can handle, or if you're more of a beginner athlete, or you feel that the first race really took a lot out of you. Secondly, doing as much, and that less is more here applies to both volume and intensity, but the way that I guess structured this part of the podcast, I particularly was talking about volume there. But secondly, when it comes to the intensity, doing as much frequency of intensity as normal, that is okay, but it does not equal doing as much load of intensity as normal. When having a short turnaround time between races, I don't think it makes much sense to go deep in any session you do between them. You can do solid sessions, don't get me wrong, but a good mantra for these sessions would be hard but controlled. And finally, I just want to make a quick note on the importance of building a strong base coming into this racing season with a strong baseline fitness. If you do, then it will be so much easier to basically get things right and have leeway, have the ability to train less between two races if you feel that your recovery is going slower, but still not lose too much fitness. That base fitness is so deep that you're not really losing it as quickly. But if, on the other hand, your fitness is more a house of cards, so to say, then yeah, you're going to lose it quite quickly as well. And then you really need to make sure that you get in that training between the races. So the stronger you can make your base fitness, the more consistent you've been throughout winter and leading in all the way to the race season, just training week in, week out, day in, day out consistently, the better it will be. The easier a time you will have to first be able to adjust volume and intensity, maybe reduce it, and still be able to perform well week after week without losing fitness quickly. But secondly, it will also help you to just recover faster from races. So it will make it easier actually to plan your time between these races. So in summary, in today's episode, we talked about how long to recover after a race, and that depends on the distance of the race, but also your individual athletic attributes. We also talked about how long to taper before the next race, and that can be, it definitely doesn't have to be a 1 week taper, because when we are racing in quick succession after each other, then we don't carry as much training load accumulated after when we go into the second race as we did going into the first race generally. And we discussed how much training and how much hard training you should do between races, and that during that normal period you can basically use your baseline training as a guide for both the volume and the frequency of intensity. But in terms of the load of the intensity, it should be slightly lighter than when you're in your kind of building up to the race training period. And finally, we talked about the importance of building a strong base to maintain fitness between races and having flexibility, being able to recover fast, but also being able to take more time to recover and still not lose fitness if you need that after a particular race. That's it for today's TTS Thursday, which is the last one in a while. I really hope that you enjoyed it. And please do send me feedback on what you think about going to one weekly podcast episode. My email is michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and it's Michael with a K, and I would love to hear what you think. Thank you to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Go and get a free hydration plan, but also check out their new product range, the Precision Fuel, which includes a drink mix and gels. And no matter which products you're going for, electrolytes or fuel, you can get 15% off your order with the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW15. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses, and get 20% off your order on roka.com/TTS. I'm going to do an open water swim right now as I stop recording. I'm going to use my Roka Maverick MX for this session because I'm racing in a few days, and I'm just going to save my Maverick X2 for the race and keep it dry and keep it clean. And then on race day, I will feel even faster, even though I know that in the Maverick MX, I will feel really, really fast. So that's just a little personal anecdote. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.